And you're live.
Hi, I'm Richard Dolan. Welcome to the next installment of UFOs The Big Picture. This is a kind of a casual series. We're in my backyard here, where I just wanted to talk sort of casually off the cuff with you about important topics relating to the UFO subject. Quick and easy, get in, get out, we're done. So this is about abductions. I'll have other themes in the future: military encounters, politics of the cover-up, and so on, breakaway civilization. But now abductions, because really, in a sense, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of this UFO phenomenon. And I think it's fair to say, when people talk about UFOs, the question is, are aliens taking human beings? Comes up all the time. And without a doubt, I would say that the idea of abductions is a very kind of politically significant one in terms of, if this were to come out in terms of a disclosure, I think that would be one of the more volatile issues around. So first thing I want to say is that not all UFO researchers, even people who believe UFOs are real, agree that abductions are actually happening. Believe it or not, this phenomenon's been around for such a long time, and still people cannot agree on it. But I would say that there's a large consensus among researchers that this is probably going on. We've had a number of very interesting cases of individuals who are very psychologically stable, who have memories, in many cases conscious memories, and in some cases memories that are kind of gotten out through hypnotic regression, of being taken by non-human beings, being brought to a place, presumably a craft, but who really knows, where they're monitored and examined, physically examined by non-human beings. This has happened so many times now. The first major account that really got a lot of attention in the modern world was the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. That was way back in 1961. And these were a married couple who were out in New Hampshire. They were coming back from a trip to Canada and were expecting to be home at a certain time at night. They got back 2 to 3 hours later and had many. You're going to just take care of the that noise. We've got some construction going on. If you would ask him just to chill. This is what happens with live stream. They got home much later, but the point was this: on the way home from their trip, they had what was an incredible UFO sighting, an incredible UFO encounter. And that much they remembered consciously. Barney, who was a rational skeptic of all of these types of things, saw it, got out of his car, walked to probably within 100 feet of this craft that had lights. He saw windows. He saw what he thought were beings inside the windows, and then the next thing they remember, he was running back to the car in terror. They drove home, and they got home like 2 hours later. They went through a series of hypnotic regressions several years later because they couldn't shake this memory. Separately, to one of the most experienced hypnotherapists in the country, a man named Dr. Benjamin Simon, who through a series of regressions extracted a totally consistent memory from the two of them of being taken aboard an alien craft. Tracy just took care of the construction. Thank you, Tracy. Where they remembered essentially the same thing from their own perspective. Barney was taken, physically examined. Betty was physically examined, and so on. This was written about in a book and a number of articles, and became a huge sensation in the 1960s. People have argued about the Hill abduction case to this day, but my take on it is that they were taken, and really the only question is by whom. And some people believe it was a military abduction, and there are reasons to think that, but there are also reasons not to think that. One reason to think it is that Barney believed he saw uniforms on these beings. But he also saw the beings as like 4 feet tall and not human size, and not exactly human, but humanoid. And Betty had the same memory under regression. So what do you do with that? Is it an implanted false memory way back in 1961, maybe, but maybe they were actually remembering non-human beings. Fast forward, there was a number of cases in the 60s and 70s, but let's go to Travis Walton from 1975. And Travis's case is interesting. I've really gotten to know him personally quite well. Probably Travis Walton's abduction case is the most famous in modern history. They made a movie about it, Fire in the Sky, book by the same name that he wrote. It's an excellent book. And Travis has been totally consistent over many, many years in telling his story. And essentially, in 1975, he was a young guy, 22 years old, a logger, on a contract in Arizona, in a forest, taking out lumber with a bunch of other guys. At the end of the day, they get into a truck to go home, and they see, in the woods, in the forest, a craft coming down. All the guys saw it. There were 7 witnesses, Travis and 6 others. And Travis was in the front passenger seat of the truck as they were about to leave. For whatever reason, he gets out, walks to this object that's low, treetop level. The guys in the truck are yelling at him to come back. He's standing there in front of this thing, and it shoots a beam of light, bright, bright blue light, hits him in the chest, knocks him 10, 15 feet back. He's flat on his back. He looks like he's dead. His friends think that he's dead, and briefly they panic and take off. 10 minutes later, they get themselves together and decide to go back, and by then Travis was gone. Travis Walton was gone for 5 days. He was the object of a major manhunt. We're talking 100 people, police tracking dogs, helicopters, people on horseback, all of it. And no one could find a trace of him for 5 days until he turns up, unshaven, dehydrated, makes a phone call. Back then, no cell phones. Calls from a payphone, and the media circus begins. All the UFO researchers came in, and the whole thing became this circus. Travis Walton was a very, very shy kind of a person, particularly back then, and didn't want the attention. You could really see this. But he had his experience, and what he distinctly remembered. And this is without hypnosis. The memory just was there. Despite the fact that he was gone for 5 days, he only had a memory for really less than an hour, seems to me, maybe an hour and a half, of being on a craft, being on a table, non-humans over him. He panics. He's very weak. He takes a swing at one of them. And their response is simply to file out of the room. They don't even deal with him. He goes into another room, and he's at a control panel, and the next thing he knows, it's an empty room, and a human being, completely human, walks into the room, takes him out, doesn't say a word, brings him into a room with other people, and the next thing Travis knows, he's on the ground, on Earth, sees the craft above him taking off. And that's his story. Travis Walton took several polygraph tests. The guys that he worked with took polygraph tests as well. And significantly, they all passed. One man who didn't pass was a previous felon who was hiding his felony conviction. And skeptics said, oh, well, you lied about that. But that's not true. All of these guys passed their polygraphs. Travis took multiple ones, passed them repeatedly. So you have to assume there's all of these guys taking the same test. The co-workers were being asked, did you see a UFO? Yes. Did you kill Travis Walton? No. And so on and so on. So that's an amazing event, and I think we have to credit it. There have been many, many events since then, but really the thing that we want to keep in mind with abductions is that the research that has followed from the 1980s onward, because that's really when abductions became a major object of study by researchers. Researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, and then John Mack, and nowadays Yvonne Smith and Barbara Lamb and Kathleen Martin, they see patterns. And it's the patterns that are important. Back in the early 90s, Dave Jacobs, who had done huge numbers of regressions of individuals, saw patterns that allowed him to piece together an abduction, a classic abduction scenario. Like what happens here, then what happens, then what happens. You get taken in this room, and then the being comes out, and he stares at you in a telepathic way that frequently would calm the person down. Jacobs called it mind scan. And all of these other factors come into these abduction encounters, that all of these separate individuals, it's not as though they were conferring with each other to come up with a scenario. What Jacobs found, and what other researchers have found since, is that there's tremendous consistencies in these abduction encounters that give them a great amount of power. Now, in his conclusion, Dave Jacobs is very, very forthright about this, is that this isn't even an occupation, it's an invasion. They're coming in. What are they doing, in his opinion? They're creating human-alien hybrids. Why? Well, maybe to integrate themselves into our society. If that is true, that's a very explosive reality, is it not? Now, maybe, just maybe, these beings have been here a very long time. It's my own opinion that we've been visited by others that have been cohabiting with us, living with us, essentially, for many, many, many years. And if that's so, I'm not quite convinced that abductions are a totally recent phenomenon, and that hybridization is necessarily a recent phenomenon. But the fact is, there's a lot we don't know about this. You know, we're dealing, when we are facing this UFO phenomenon, with something that is several steps ahead of us. And I think we have to recognize this. So the frustration that skeptics have is genuine. Like, I understand their frustration in saying, look, you can't prove that this is real. And indeed, those of us who think something's happening, we can't prove it. We haven't been able to get an alien being in front of a camera and to talk about what the whole process is about. They're not being very forthright about it. So that's the situation. But on the other hand, it's, in my view, this is not something that we can responsibly dismiss simply because we don't have a sufficient amount of provable, scientifically verified evidence to say definitively that it's aliens. There's other things that are there. There are countless numbers of people who consciously remember encounters with non-human beings. And in many of these cases, I've talked to so many of these witnesses, there's something that happened that they can't quite fully remember. And you can see very clearly someone screwing with their memories. Someone's managing their memories, wiping parts, maybe putting in screen memories, but something's happening, and yet people are remembering. Psychologists often call that bleed through. You know, it's like you've got a memory block, but the human mind is still very powerful, right? And we can still have the ability to remember things, even if imperfectly. So there's enough smoke that I believe that there's fire. And if people are being taken, if this is a genuine phenomenon, then we really have to ask ourselves why. Some researchers have their opinions. They'll say creation of hybrids and studying us biologically and so forth. That could be the case. But there could be other reasons as well. And in my view, I don't think it's time yet for us to know definitively why people are being taken. It's important. It's significant. And it very well may be the most significant part of the entire UFO phenomenon. I'm going to get ready to close here, but I just want to say there are many cases of abductions occurring explicitly in connection to UFO encounters. There are many cases of abductions occurring separate from UFO encounters. But the patterns are very, very similar. Non-human beings manipulating humans in one way or another. And I guess actually the last thing I want to add with this is the phenomenon of alien implants. And I feel that the general public doesn't have a fully sufficient appreciation of how important implants are. The late Dr. Roger Lear did a lot of extractions of these implants in people who believed that they had abduction experiences and believed they had implants, foreign objects in their bodies. They didn't know how they got there. Lear extracted quite a few of them, and eventually had enough that he was able to do an an analysis, a comparative analysis of them. And typically these implants were smaller than a grain of rice. He did an analysis with Dr. Alex Mosier, who is a physical chemist with a PhD in that field. And they did a detailed analysis that showed technology in these extracted objects. These were simply not natural objects. They appeared on one level to be of meteoric origin, all of them, but they had nanotubes, or what appeared to be nanofibers, similar to carbon nanotubes, in them. They emitted a radio frequency of about 14.5 megahertz, which is very similar to RFID chips. So the possibility that these are used to monitor people is a very real one. There's much more to say about the late Roger Lear's work on alien implants, and I would encourage you to do your own follow-up on these areas. Suffice to say, there's enough going on that we can say something's happening, it's important, no one's talking about this, at least in the public domain, the way they should be, and we need to have a real public conversation about this. Because those people who are experiencing this phenomenon, I can tell you, they're frequently traumatized. They frequently feel like they have no one to talk to in this society. They're sitting out there alone. You know, if you have what you think is an alien abduction, who the heck are you going to talk to about this? It's a very difficult and personal subject. At the very least, this is not a subject for fun and games where you know, we need to be making jokes about this. Exactly the opposite. It's serious. And those people who are dealing with it, many of them are suffering. So it's important. With that, I think we'll end this. I'm Richard Dolan. Thanks for joining me in my yard. This is the natural way to do it. We had aircraft, we had noise, but we got through it. And I'm glad you were here with me. And I want to thank my wife, Tracy, for doing the shooting. I want to thank those of you who are supporting me through contributions, super chats, and your support. It means a lot to me, and I want to thank you for that as well. I also want to thank my friends and producers, Lori and Michael, for everything that they do to make this happen. I couldn't do it without them. Thanks, guys.